Hey everyone, this is Chapter 14, Introduction to Qualitative Research, whereas Chapter 4 gives us an introduction to quantitative research. This chapter gives us an introduction to qualitative research, which is the other half of the social science approach of doing communication research. So we've talked about quantitative research in Chapter 4, and this is an introduction in this chapter. In today's chapter, we'll be looking at how qualitative researchers do their work, what are the philosophies or principles that drive this kind of work, i.e., qualitative research, the emphasis on inductive analysis or the inductive reasoning that undergirds qualitative research. We'll also be talking about how qualitative researchers establish credibility. So that's an important concept. We'll be touching on that credibility concept towards the end of today's lecture. We'll be talking about how research questions are used in guiding the qualitative research and how do qualitative researchers derive meaning and present their findings or analyses. Finally, we'll be also be talking about the advantages and disadvantages of qualitative research. So firstly, qualitative research is about preserving the form and content of human interactions. Qualitative researchers, unlike quantitative researchers, were interested to study how interactions or the exchange of messages happen in the natural setting. When we say natural setting, we mean that the environment that people exist naturally, not in the laboratories, in our research labs, or a place or confined space where researchers, typically quantitative researchers, can control. So, what would be examples? Examples would be, say, families interacting at home. So, that's their natural environment because that's typically where families gather together. They might be sharing a meal, talking about the day, what might be interesting, what's coming up for the week, things like that. So, that's the natural environment. Okay, so we as qualitative researchers were interested to preserve that unique conversation or the context of the environment, keeping it intact and then studying it. So think about this. Suppose I'm interested to study how best friends interact with one another. So I ask you and say, contact your best friend and then bring your best friend to my lab. I would like to see the two of you interact for half an hour and see how best friends talk. Now you can imagine that can create a quite an awkward situation because you and your best friend don't talk or usually hang out at a research lab. So you probably contact your best friend over the phone or maybe through some kind of social media, or maybe if you live close to your best friend, maybe you hang out at a coffee shop or a park or somewhere that you two like to go to. So those would be the natural environments. So qualitative researchers, we put a lot of emphasis on the communication that happens in that natural setting. It's contextually situated. So when we take the people or the participants that we want to study and we take them out of the context, then the conversations, the nature of topics, and the ability that they interact or exchange ideas, that changes. Those things will change because it is outside the natural flow of how they interact, how they exchange messages. So context is extremely key. We do not take participants typically do not take them out of their context to study them their conversations. Rather, the qualitative researcher enters into that natural environment, of course, with the participants' permission, enters into that environment to study, to understand the interactions that take place in that specific context. For qualitative research, this course is the data that we collect or the data that we collect, but we also analyze them. So data or this course in this situation are the naturally occurring talks or gestures. The naturally occurring talk or gestures. So these things again this idea goes back to being contextually situated, going back to where the natural environment of the subjects or the participants of interest. Qualitative research is also empirical, so this element is shared between qualitative research as well as quantitative research. So, qualitative research is empirical because we collect data, we analyze it, so we believe the truth is out there. And I'll come back to talk about truth in a moment, but I want to finish off with this point here. So, unlike quantitative research, qualitative research is inductive and interpretive. What does that mean? When we say that it is inductive, or we use the inductive approach, inductive analysis, or inductive reasoning, we are moving from the specific to the general. Okay, from the specific to the general, from a specific instance or set of data that we collect, very specific, we broaden to theorize, to generalize it to the broader population. It is interpretive because the researcher is a research tool that is part of the research process. The researcher, his or her experiences, interpretations of the world, even biases, these are the things that shape the lens through which the researcher views the world and views the data being collected and analyzed. So it's based on the researcher's interpretation. So a set of data that's collected could be analyzed by different researchers. They can quite possibly produce different interpretations because different people see things differently. In qualitative research, we aim for subjectivity. What does that mean? It connects back to this previous concept about interpretive. It is interpretive work because it depends on how each individual views or each researcher views the world. So the meaning can be different, and therefore many subjective ways of seeing things or understanding things. So it's subjective. So qualitative research does not seek to establish the one truth or the ultimate truth, the one version of truth that explains everything. That's not the focus of qualitative research. Instead, qualitative research is interested in the multiple possible truths or multiple versions of truths that can be explained or can be used to explain what has been observed. So we are emphasizing the subjectivity, so allowing different versions of truths to emerge and to be recognized. And because of that, we allow interactants or the participants' voices to be heard, because everyone, as I said before, everyone views the world differently. We see things differently. We assign different meanings to different things. Even the same thing, we assign different meanings. And so everyone's views and voices are important and should be heard. And the qualitative research values those different voices and those subjective differences between participants. Um, just a quick explanation of this term interactant here. You see this more often being used in qualitative research, but essentially what interactants mean is the same as participants or research subjects. It's the same term, but it's a term that's more used in qualitative research. Qualitative research is also based on intersubjectivity. So when we look at intersubjectivity, what we're talking about, we're interested in how people co-construct and coexist in establishing the interactions in their social lives and the rules for doing so. And when we say the rules, we mean how do they abide by those rules in their social lives, the environment, the context that shape their interactions and their relationships. So those interactions that govern or shape or guide how people interact with one another. It is important because Qualitative researchers do not believe that it is that one thing leads to the other. And let me explain that because that is a bit confusing and it's not quite clear. What that means is that we're not saying that there is some direction that A therefore must lead to B. Okay, if the presence of this thing here will lead to something else, so A leads to B. That's not exactly how qualitative research thinks. Qualitative researchers think that life and interactions are more like a process rather than a linear relationship of things. Okay, we don't believe that things are so necessarily directional, so A therefore leads to B, but we believe that things are a bit more process based, meaning to say everything has the ability to shape different things at the same time. They are mutually, simultaneously shaping one another. The world that we live in are constantly being shaped by things in the past, things in the present, and ultimately that affects how the future will transpire. So every element has some kind of interaction or influence to some degree on everything that will happen. So because of that, we want to seek to understand the participants or interactants' way of understanding things that they experience as well as how they interpret those processes. So remember in previous slide we talked about subjectivity. So we are really drawing upon that idea that different people see even the same things quite differently. Imagine this, suppose all of us were to go to watch a baseball game or a basketball game. All of us were in the class, all of us are going to the baseball game. We're all sitting in the same section, all in the same row. We're all watching the same game. We will arrive at the same time. We'll watch everything, the entire game till it ends, and we leave at the same time. Now we all went through the same experience and seeing it from pretty much the same angles, the same seats, same section of the stadium or arena, but we all can take away quite different meanings or have different feelings at the end of the game. Perhaps your favorite player did not play, so you were a little bit disappointed. Perhaps your favorite player missed a chance to score a goal or score a point, and you feel a bit upset too. Or maybe your best team won and your favorite team won, so you're happy. Or maybe there are different reasons that will cause different people to have different emotions or attribute different meanings to what they saw from the game, even though we are experiencing the same event. Therefore, qualitative research is interested to expand and understand why do people have all those differences, those different experiences, despite experiencing the same interaction or the same event. And ultimately, how are those messages, the communication being socially situated? Again, back to the context, back to the rules that determine or govern how those interactions should look like socially, the rules that govern those social interactions. Kind of alluded to the concept of mutual simultaneous shaping earlier, but everything influences everything else in the here and now. What that means is that everything has an influence or everything has the potential to influence something else that's happening. It's like imagine it's not one linear path where one thing affects the other, like a domino effect. You push one tile and then it falls down and then it pushes the next tile and then there's this domino effect, but rather everything has a potential influence or impact, and that ultimately with different things happening maybe at the same time or simultaneously, they create some kind of momentum that affects something that will to come. Okay, think about sometimes when we feel really upset or very happy. It's not always because of one thing that happened, but maybe there is some compounding factor. Maybe a few things happen. Say you something bad happened in the morning, it took a long time to commute to work, okay, maybe there was a traffic jam, okay, or then when you get to your office, there is no place to park. Usually at this time there's a space, but somehow there is no place to park, so you have to circle around the block 4, 5, 6 times. Finally found a spot, you parked, and then oh, the meter is not working, whatever it is, okay. So maybe there's this accumulation of many unfavorable events, and ultimately one thing at the very end of the day just snapped, okay, just created this very unhappy sense of feeling. So everything has the potential to influence everything else. And so, as communication researchers who are interested in qualitative research, we put the emphasis on the process that happens and the meanings that come out from those events of that process. We seek, as qualitative researchers, we seek plausible explanations. Remember, subjectivity, there are many possible interpretations and many possible explanations. We try to find many plausible explanations, um, the range of all of those, and then we try to make sense of those. Which one seems to be most plausible? Which one, meaning to say, which one seems to be more accurate or more true to the data being collected and based on the interpretation of the researcher or researchers. Later in today's chapter, we will talk about triangulation. So that's also about how different researchers, if they work on the same team, how they come to a common conclusion, as well as triangulation with participants, making sure that the researchers' interpretations square with or are also consistent, aligned with the participants' perspective. But more on that, all of those about triangulation in the later slide today. Inductive analysis, we may also sometimes use the term inductive reasoning as the foundation of doing research, qualitative research especially. The inductive analysis moves from specific instances to general. And what that means is that we are interested in specific phenomenons or very specific contexts affecting the individuals, the natural actors in that situation. We use inductive analysis as a way to reason for qualitative researchers, to reason, to discover and develop theories as they emerge from the data. So when we go from very specific instances, say the baseball game, we broaden it out to develop some kind of theory about why fans of a specific sports team feel a certain way. By taking time to complete more observations or reading and rereading through the data, which we are part of the inductive and iterative approach of inductive analysis, we, the qualitative researchers, become more familiar with the setting and with the interactants, the communication between them, and ultimately able to establish potential interpretations or plausible explanations of what we have observed in the data. So as we become more familiar, we the qualitative researchers become more familiar with the data that we collect, and as we experiment or explore the possible explanations to it to give meaning to the data, theories can then emerge because we generalize it, broaden it, moving from the specific to the general. Here's a visual summary of what we have been talking about so far, building upon earlier chapters, especially chapters 1, 2, mostly chapters 1 and 2, but also building upon more on the qualitative model. So we see that a research always starts off with a purpose. There's a research problem that we are interested in studying. So we talked about this in earlier chapters, and after we have established a research problem, we visit the research, not the research question, but we visit the existing literature, which is this dotted line circle that we see right here. We visit the existing literature to see what have other researchers done or collected or found that is related to or very closely related to the phenomenon that we're interested to explore or to understand, the one that we want to study right here. And based on what we have learned from the existing literature, we can then shape our research questions to align with the language or the terminology that other researchers use in this area of work. So with our research questions, it guides the way we collect data, which is this portion right here. We enter into the setting, the natural environment, in other words, to collect our data. Notice that this is a two-way arrow. When we enter into the setting, the researcher must have some kind of idea what to look for, how to collect the data, but the researcher will not know exactly what happens until he or she enters into the setting, and then the researcher might realize that their data collection method or methods was not appropriate or suitable. So what the researcher must do then is to back up to this stage right here and reinvestigate and evaluate what might be a better approach to collect data. After making that adjustment, the researcher can then enter back to the setting and then collect data right here. Data that has been collected has to be analyzed, interpreted, in other words, give a meaning to what the data means. And again, you notice there's this two-way arrow, meaning to say the data that's been collected may not be adequate for the researcher to establish a theory to explain the phenomenon that's been studied. So the researcher can always return to the setting or the natural environment to collect additional data. Sometimes researchers might go back and forth multiple times, and that's okay. They collect data, they analyze it, they interpret it, they realize it's not enough data, they go back to setting, collect more data, come back, analyze, and then realize, oh, something new pops up. Maybe we should collect some more data to reconfirm or to verify if the finding is accurate. We go back to the setting. So it can be an iterative back and forth process. It's not a problem. Although sometimes qualitative researchers they might go from here, enter into the setting, collect data, and then once they've collected the entire corpus or body of data that they want, they decided okay, no need to go back to setting anymore. We analyze the data, and so they don't go back and forth, and that is also acceptable. It depends on the design of the qualitative study. Member validation is when we bring the findings back to the participants to ask them to what extent do they think that the findings or the analysis ring true to their personal experience. So in other words, asking the participants to verify the accuracy of the findings. So the researchers might make adjustments based on participants' feedback, or perhaps participants might say, yep, those findings are completely accurate, reflecting of my experience. Then the researcher has no need to make any adjustments to those analyses. Again, if it's necessary, researcher can always pedal back and go back to the setting to collect more data and then do more analysis interpretation. So you see that this flow chart here, this model of qualitative research, not really linear because we can always go back and forth making adjustments. So less linear and more less linear, less directional than the quantitative approach. The credibility of the qualitative research is crucial because of the subjectivity that qualitative researchers emphasize. Because of the subjectivity, multiple interpretations are possible, then the credibility of the researcher, the research process, and the findings ultimately are key in helping the readers believe that this is a robustly conducted research, that the data interpretations can be taken to be true and accurate, is correct, as well as dependable. Bearing in mind that we do research based on the research problem that we're interested in, but also grounded in existing literature. So the literature that informs the present research, those findings affect future research. So research findings have to be dependable. If not, then it affects future research, because then future researchers are using inaccurate or false inaccurate findings, and building upon that, we know that that will just make things worse. We'll be further away from the realities that we want to study. Because of subjectivity, it allows us multiple interpretations. Credibility ultimately goes back to the question to ask, what is plausible? What is the plausible explanations that we can discover from the data being collected? And among all plausible explanations or possible interpretations, which one seems to be most accurate or most reliable, most truthful to the participants' realities, the participants' experiences? In the previous slide, we talked about triangulation a little bit, but this is the slide that we'll be waiting for, and triangulation helps us to enhance credibility, and there are several ways we can do triangulation. The first way is data triangulation. So this form of triangulation allows us to establish credibility by using multiple or different sources of data, and then or different data types in one study. So multiple sources could be, say, I'm interested in, for example, students' interest in chocolate, how they consume chocolate. So I can have multiple data sources, say, get a set of data from city A, and then compare it with city B and city C. Okay, so different cities, I have different research teams collect data from these different cities, and then I can compare them. I triangulate them. Alternatively, I can also I can use different data types. So perhaps some students in the same university, I use a qualitative approach. I interview them, and then another subset of these students from the same university, I might not interview them, but they fill out a paper survey or a paper questionnaire. So using different data types, that also allows me to triangulate. Investigator triangulation refers to having multiple research members on the team. So when we have different research members, we have different interpretations, as we talked about previously, different observations, and by doing that, the researchers can interact with one another to see how their interpretations are similar or different, and then they can come to a consensus, a common interpretation of the data. Interdisciplinary triangulation can also take place, especially with researchers coming from different disciplines. Different disciplines have different emphasis. Sometimes, even if they're studying the same thing or the phenomenon or event, they have different emphasis or they have different interests. And so, by having researchers from different disciplines working together on the same project, it helps to see what can be interesting across the disciplines that researchers represent. So triangulation through the use of multiple sources of data or multiple investigators from the same or different disciplines can help us to dispel doubts about the reality of a finding and enhance the credibility of the qualitative research process. Member check or member validation, same concept, member check or member validation, as I've talked about previously, will be about taking the findings back to the participants and then asking them to see if the findings are similar or consistent with their experiences. So triangulation as well as member check or member validation, these are great ways to enhance credibility, and these are the examples, the explanations of these concepts. Research questions help to guide, so research questions help to guide The qualitative research, they are almost always broadly stated because it allows the researcher to explore the phenomenon, to go into the natural setting to see how the participants live their lives and make meaning of the interactions or messages in that natural setting. Typically, it's non-directional, so we're asking broad questions so that we can see how, again, back to the central phenomenon that we're interested to look at. Broad questions gives the researcher latitude to follow up on interesting paths. So, as we said, there are things where the researcher doesn't always understand or know until the researcher enters into the setting. So, once the researcher enters into the setting, the researcher might find there's something that was not thought about before but seems to appear interesting and intrigues the researcher. So, the researcher can then follow up on the interesting path. Research questions also help us to be more specific, to be specific on the interaction context, being focused on the instance that we are studying, or the context or the environment. So again, back to talking about moving from the specific to the general. How do we know that a qualitative research question is a good research question, or how do we know it's a good research question? Typically, research questions are framed as a how or a what question. So these are typically a good way to ask a research question. They should reference the research site, meaning the setting that we're studying. So let's say we're interested to know how students of University X, how do they think about, say, um, environmental issues, for instance. So University X will be the research site because it's the location where we find those participants. Is it focused on a specific type of interaction? So is it between, say, student and student, or student and faculty, or student with the general public in general? So what kind of specific instance are we looking at? Does the research question allow us to discover the meaning that's been developed or shared between the participants that we are interested to learn from, to investigate, to explore, to learn about their meanings that they give to those interactions? Do they typically allow us to be embedded in the environment to see how naturally occurring communication takes place? So that is a strength of qualitative research because we can see those communication taking place in a natural environment. Is the research question framed broadly enough so that if there were to be unanticipated phenomenon or interesting leads, can we have the flexibility to pursue those interesting findings, or rather those interesting leads that might help us see in a way that are important, things that are important to the participants, which we did not have anticipated or be able to predict even before the study was conducted. Does it allow us to study the process of the participants in their natural environment? And that's a key thing because communication is about the process, and qualitative research emphasizes on that process. That means the events that would lapse over time. And ultimately, when we do qualitative research, our research question should help us drive to think about what might be the potential influences or the factors that impact the participants as they communicate, interact with one another in the specific context. What counts as qualitative data? Well, anything that can be observed or captured can be considered as a qualitative, or can be considered as part of qualitative data. So anything that can be observed and captured. So it doesn't have to be text messages, for example, or maybe nothing doesn't have to be things that are written. It can be pictures, for example, pictures. So Instagram pictures, posts, those will be fine. Things that you can observe, meaning to say things you can see, that will be good. Okay, those will be considered as or can count as qualitative data. Methods of interpreting meaning of those qualitative data. So this is an interesting thing to have, spend a little bit of time talking about it. So what is researcher construction? From the researcher's perspective, there are subjective position or perspective on the experience. So the researcher develops an interpretation based on his or her subjective position and perspective. So the evidence that's been presented or the interpretation of the data is fully constructed based on the researcher's reality. So that's the researcher construction, what that means. How about subjective valuing? What is subjective valuing? Subjective valuing acknowledges that there are tangible artifacts or objective sources of meaning. So when we say tangible artifacts, we mean things that are observable, things that probably that we can touch and feel. So say a mug or a cup or newspaper articles. So these days we all read news on the internet from a web, but we can also have newspapers that are physical copies. So things that are artifacts that are tangible. Okay, so even though these sources have objective meaning to them or they're objective sources, the researchers must still nevertheless make some interpretation of those objective elements. So as a result, the researcher's subjectivity is introduced into the interpretation of meaning. So with this type of meaning construction, the researcher mixes his or her interpretations with interpretations received directly from the participants. So what that means is that the subjective valuing, we try to establish as much of the meaning based on the sources, the data sources that we receive. But again, we understand that whenever there's some kind of interpretation, the researcher's view can also shape or color the way the researcher sees the meanings. So less subjectivity than the researcher construction. Contingent accuracy relies on tangible artifacts similar to subjective valuing, but contingent accuracy believes that accurate representation of the phenomenon is key. So the contingent accuracy is the most objective of the three positions. So the three right here, these three. However, some subjectivity is introduced when the researcher selects some elements over others to use as evidence. What that means is that based on the entire body of data that researcher collects, the researcher still has to make some kind of selection, some decision making on what to present as the best evidence to demonstrate the meanings of participants. So by by selecting the most appropriate or most useful elements of that data set, it also demonstrates that interpretation and subjectivity is introduced and affecting the interpretation and the quality, credibility of the work. So all in all, if direct quotes from research participants are available and the researcher selects the ones that require the least additional interpretation, then contingent accuracy has been established or achieved. Next, as we think about qualitative data, there are different levels of that. There are these three levels over here. The best way to explain it I've seen is the one on page 254 table 14.1, where we have as a micro level evidence, say, a television show, so a specific episode or maybe a specific series of a show. A mid-level kind of data could be a body of work, so maybe from the same producer, okay, for the same source, maybe from the same novel, same book. So you see that we're increasing in the volume and size and scope from micro level to mid level. And when we move to The macro level, it can be all television shows, so it doesn't have to be from the same producer or the same author or the same novel or the series of novels, but all television shows. So we broaden from the most specific, most micro level to mid level, and then most broadly to encompassing all forms of the same genre or the same form of entertainment. What are the advantages and disadvantages or limitations of qualitative research? Advantage is that we can document the unseen, so things that are difficult to observe if we are not in a natural setting. By doing qualitative research, we enter into that environment and we can then have the ability to capture those things that are typically taken for granted or not observed. Advantage of qualitative research allows us to document things or events that we can observe. Typically, it's difficult to replicate. So things that happen live, things that happen once off, doesn't always repeat, cannot be the repeated in a very similar way multiple times. So then that's the advantage of qualitative research. It supplements quantitative studies because it provides the nuances and details of subjectivity that is been missed by qualitative researchers. What is the limitation then or disadvantage of qualitative research? It means that we must have access to the environment of interest. If we have if we have no access to that environment, then we cannot collect those phenomenon or those data that's unseen and those that aren't replicable. Without those access, these advantages cannot be realized. So it is a disadvantage or limitation. Interactors may change their behavior, especially when they know that there are people observing them. So if researchers are observing these individuals and they know they've been observed, then they might change their behavior, and that's a limitation because we're not seeing participants behaving in their natural ways. Observations are also filtered through the researcher's subjectivity, the researcher's view of how things are, the reality of construction of or the construction of reality, and so that is also one limitation that's affecting qualitative research, and also is time consuming because qualitative research takes a lot of time and effort to be in the environment, to participate and to observe the participants in the natural setting. So those are the disadvantages of qualitative research. Threats to credibility, definitely inaccurate or incomplete data because, as we know, if there is no complete set or if participants behave in quite different ways because they know they're being observed, then the data is not accurate, and so that affects the analysis as well. Interpretation, back to subjectivity, the problem with interpretation is that we give meaning to what we observe, but in reality, is it the researchers who are imposing what they believe to be true on the data, or are they explaining what the data say? Meaning to say, are they talking about the findings in the way that participants view the world, which is the truth, the reality from their perspective, or is it mostly about how the researcher wants to see the world? So those differences can affect credibility. Theoretical validity. What about the data that will fall in that interpretation? What that means is that what if the data doesn't allow the researcher to tell the story that he or she desires to say? So that would be not a good way to do research. Rather, the researcher must honestly and authentically explain the data being collected, what it means from the participant's point of view. Remember in a very early slide, we talked about giving participants the voice because we want to explain what not the researchers, but what the participants are experiencing, what reality looks like from their point of view. We're interested in giving them that space to give them their voice. It's about the participants and not about the researcher. There can be selection bias, meaning to say the researcher might be selective in choosing the data that the researcher wants to present, so that can skew the findings and that will not be accurate or authentic to the data being collected. And there is also another bias that can potentially happen, which is the reactivity bias, which is the influence of the researcher on the interactions because of the or rather because of the researcher's presence. So all in all, good qualitative researchers must endeavor to minimize this form of bias as well as this form of bias by monitoring our interactions with the participants as well as the activities that we are studying. So we see in today's lecture, we see how qualitative research is different than quantitative research, because qualitative research is interested in the social construction of meaning. We're interested to use the inductive approach to study things from the specific to the general. We are concerned about credibility. How do we strengthen or enhance credibility? And we look at triangulation as well as member check or member validation. And we look at how these possible threats can exist in challenging the credibility of qualitative research. And that wraps up this chapter.